Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we're going to be discussing Ramadan. Joining us on the show is a doctor in Christian and Islamic theology, Dr. ChrisHewer. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
A pleasure.
Let's start off with looking at the concept of fasting. Do Abrahamic religions all have fasting within their religion?
The Quran actually begins the verse by telling us that fasting is commanded from you, just as it was commanded from the people of the earlier revelations too. And therefore we can say that fasting is a natural part of the religious relationship between the individual and the community and God. So it's a natural part of religion. In looking at Ramadan today, we're going to be looking at the communal part of that rather than the individual, which is there are people who fast at other times of the year for other things and so on. So leaving that to one side, communal times of fasting then are there within the Jewish tradition. We have the fasting on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is a 25-hour total fast from sunset one day until after sunset the next day. And within the Christian tradition, we have the 2 seasons of preparation fasting, as it were, 4 weeks before the time of Christmas and 40 days before the time of Easter. Now, the second one is called Lent, and that's the one that we hear most about. But this in the Christian tradition is interpreted in a wide variety of different ways. There are some groups who will fast every day in abstaining from food and drink for a large part of the day. There are other people who will only fast on certain days, perhaps only from food. There will be other people who don't fast from food and drink at all, but seek to do additional acts of piety and of compassion within society. So I think we can say in summary, there really isn't anything in the contemporary practice of Judaism and Christianity that could be put alongside the fast of Ramadan and said that's an equal or equivalent.
How does Ramadan actually work?
Well, first of all, we have to say that the Islamic calendar, like many calendars around the world, is a lunar calendar. So each month begins with the sighting of the new moon. The next thing to say is that a lunar year is only 354 days long. This means that everything timed by the lunar calendar appears, when we look from the perspective of the solar calendar, which is our January, February, March calendar, it appears to move forward by about 11 days every year because the year is shorter. Therefore, we say Ramadan moves through the seasons of the year. It is not limited to a particular time of the year. If you had a harvest festival, for example, that would always have to be at harvest time. So Ramadan isn't like that. So it is a month-long fast. Now, a lunar month is technically 29 and a half days long. Now, that's not much good on the calendar. So in practice, lunar months are either 29 or 30 days. They can't be anything other. And so what you do is that you go out at nightfall on the 29th night and you see if you can sight the new moon. If you can sight it, tomorrow will be the first day of Ramadan, or tomorrow will be the last day and the first day of the new month. So you go and look for the new moon, and if you can sight it, then the new month will start. If you cannot sight it, tomorrow will automatically be the 30th of the present month, and then the day after that will be the first of the new month. So, a complicated business, because not all Muslims agree on how this should be done, especially when you cannot sight the new moon with the naked eye. This is why sometimes we start Ramadan or finish Ramadan on different days. Now the fasting itself is a daylight fast from first light before dawn in the morning until just after sunset. Now first light was traditionally worked out by hanging up two threads, a black one and a white one, and as soon as there was enough light to see the difference, that was first light, and you must have finished your eating before that time. And then sunset was determined either by the disappearance of the disk of the sun or by the end of the redness, the reflected light in the sky after the sun has set. Now immediately we can see that in certain parts of the world, Ramadan is going to vary hugely in terms of the length of fasting during the day, because if it's in winter it might only be 8 or 9 hours, and if it's in the height of summer it could be 18 or 19 hours. In our northern climes. Obviously, if you are living around the equator, then winter and summer days are always about the same length, about 12 or 13 hours. But it makes a difference for us. But you can see that by it moving through all the seasons of the year, for some years you endure very long days, and then after a while you endure very short days. So it balances itself out in a certain way. So a daylight fast for a month, a fast of total abstention from all foods, all drink, and all sexual relations. Now this is not at all to suggest that eating, drinking and sex are somehow dirty, nasty things. Exactly the opposite. These are some of the most powerful urges that we have as human beings. And therefore, if we can take control of those urges just during the daylight hours, just during the month of Ramadan, it is a training ground in discipline. It teaches us we are in control of what we do. We are not the victims of our habits or our appetites. And so there we have a very important aspect of Ramadan. It's a training ground in self-discipline. It's a training ground in taqwa, in God consciousness, raising our sense of awareness that we stand before God and we are accountable to God. We have been given guidance by God, and that ultimately we will be judged by God. So this sense of accountability and discipline is at the heart of the fasting month of Ramadan.
So what does the Holy Quran tell us about the purpose of Ramadan?
It tells us that your fasting is for God, first of all. So this is one of those acts of obedience that even if you cannot understand why, you should still do it. Because God knows best, it is for your good. Now, we cannot be fasting because it will do God good. God is beyond all that kind of thing. So our fasting or our not fasting does not damage or improve the quality of God. It's for us. It's about our own personal development. One of my friends, a Muslim scholar, often describes Ramadan as defrosting the fridge. You know, when the fridge gets all caked up with ice, it doesn't work very well. So you switch it off for a while and you allow it all to defrost, and you get rid of all the gunk out of the fridge. And then when you turn it back on again, it works much better. So it's a way of getting rid of some of the gunk out of our lives. Not just physically in terms of purifying our bodies through not eating, although that's part of it, but also in terms of all those habits that we formed. I cannot possibly survive without coffee at 11 o'clock. Well, you can during Ramadan. So it's a way of teaching us to break those habits and be obedient to God. and it's a way also of increasing our sensitivity to the place of food within society. You know, a lot of people in our modern urban living think that food comes from supermarkets. Milk comes out of cartons. Eggs come in little boxes. And so we lose the relationship between nature and our food. Now, for the vast majority of people on earth, if there is no rain during the summer months, there will be famine, there will be hunger during the winter months. It's that close a relationship. If there is a disease and kills the chickens, there will be no more eggs and no more meat until some new ones can be found and bought. So the relationship between nature and the human being is much closer. Whereas for us, we just think, well, if we can't get butter from England, we'll go and get it from New Zealand. So we have a different relationship, and therefore we need to raise our consciousness of that. For many people in the world, going hungry is not an option that you decide freely to take up during 1 month of the year. Going hungry is a reality that is forced upon you every single day. And therefore, feeling a little of the pangs of hunger within ourselves raises our sensitivity of the wider humanity, that humanity for whom hunger is a daily reality. And it helps us to remember that their poverty is often created by our excessive consumption. So we consume far too much of the world's goods, not just in terms of food, but in terms of all the raw commodities and so on, and our overconsumption leads to the poverty and hunger of other people in the world. So it binds the community together. The community of humankind, not just the community of Muslims. And so it raises our awareness of suffering humanity and our responsibility to do something about it. Not just in terms of giving a little bit of money, but in terms of changing our way of life, changing our values, changing our consumption habits. I actually can walk 200 meters to post the letter. I don't need to take the car.
Do all Muslims have to fast?
It is a requirement on all adult Muslims who are capable of fasting. Capable of fasting means, first of all, that they can make the intention to fast. So if you have got someone who is not mentally capable of making the decision, well, you don't chain them up and make them fast, because it has to be a free act of the individual. And so the fast begins with the declaration of intention, or niyyah. Secondly, it is for those people for whom fasting would not fundamentally be detrimental to their health and well-being. So there are some people with certain forms of illness, for example, diabetes, certain types of diabetes, who cannot abstain from food for that length of time and have instead to punctuate their day with eating. Well, God wants our ease and not our hardship. The verse about fasting actually contains this crucial point of Islamic law. God wants our ease and not our hardship. Fasting is mandatory, it is compulsory, provided that it is not going to seriously damage your health and well-being. Now, there are some groups of people who for a period of time cannot fast because it would seriously damage their health. For example, women who are pregnant. They need a regular intake of nourishment for the sake of the child that's growing within them. Women who are breastfeeding their baby, they need also that regular intake so that they can perform what is a higher responsibility. To nurture the child that grows within you and to feed it after it's born is a higher responsibility than observing the fast of Ramadan. But of course, at a later date, when the child is no longer dependent upon you, you can then catch up. So we have an idea of delaying the fast because of transitional circumstances. A woman during the time of her period, for example, doesn't fast. A man or woman who are travelling don't fast. What's travelling? Well, it's not getting on the bus and going 20 miles down the road. But if you're doing 20 miles across the Sahara, then that's travelling. So again, intelligence comes in here, and you have to decide, is this seriously detrimental to your observance or not? Somebody who is sick would also not fast during those days. They would catch up later.
When we actually look at Ramadan, and you mentioned that the verse of the Holy Quran says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants our ease and not our hardship. But sometimes, and it's always usually the first 2 to 3 days, that there is that hardship in the sense that you're used to having your coffee at this certain time or having a certain intake of water. So that's where the difficulty comes in. But after mainly 3 days, it becomes like your body gets used to it. So in that sense, what can we actually do accordingly? Because some people feel that from the first or second day that it's too hard for them, so kind of like give up or tend to say that I'll just do my fasting later on.
I think that first of all we should counsel people exactly that the hardest days are the first few days, so don't give up at that stage. Try and keep going. And obviously, if you get it, to the end of the first week, and it is so seriously detrimental to your health that you just can't do it, then preserving your health is a higher ethical value. And instead, you observe the spirit of fasting, the additional prayers, the additional study of Quran, the giving of charity, the reflection on your life, and so on. But you just are not able to fast. Now, who knows? You know, and God knows, and God cannot be fooled. So this isn't a get-out clause for lazy people, because we are accountable to God if we do not fast. But if we know, and God knows, that this actually is just not possible for us, then God wants our ease and not our hardship.
During the month of Ramadan, what is required of a Muslim to do?
Well, first of all, it is to fast during the daylight hours. And it is to break the fast punctually. Again, this is where God wants your ease and not your hardship comes in. God is not interested that some young man says, full of bravado, I could go on for another 2 hours because I'm a hard man. Not at all. It's not about how hard you are. It's about how obedient you are. And therefore, breaking the fast punctually is very important. And it is a communal fast. This needs to be stressed, that within a household, brothers and sisters will wake each other up early and say, come on, come downstairs, have something to eat, have something to drink before the fasting starts, otherwise it will be harder for you. Toward the end of the day, when it becomes difficult, the younger ones gather around the grandmother who says, come on, we'll tough this out together, and so on. So it's communal, it's binding people together. That's why fasting during these days, and not postponing it for some unnecessary reason, is not permitted. It is to fast during these days, unless there's some necessary reason, because it's communal. But then we have a whole battery of other things that are not concerned with eating and drinking and such like. And these are also of great importance. So we know that it was during the month of Ramadan that the Quran was first sent to the Prophet, and therefore it is called the month of the Quran. And this is marked in 2 ways. First of all, an increased intensity in Quran study, hearing Quran recitation, reading the Quran for oneself. and many people will try to observe the discipline of reading the whole of the Quran during the month of Ramadan, and therefore it's divided up into 30 parts. But also on the night of the commemoration, Laylat al-Qadr as it's called, the night of the first revelation of the Quran, we're told that this is one of the most blessed of all nights, that the gates of heaven are thrown wide open, that the angels are sent abroad to hear our prayers and to see who's spending the night in prayer. The difficulty is that we're not entirely sure which night it was. We know that it was one of the odd-numbered nights during the last 10 days of Ramadan. Many people will just observe the 27th night. Other people will say, no, that's not good enough. It could have been one of the other nights. And so some people will try to observe all the odd-numbered nights during the month, the last 10 days of Ramadan, so that they can be sure that they have, as it were, hit the right day, this auspicious day when the gates of heaven are thrown open. So that's the first thing to say. Ramadan is the month of the Quran. Secondly, it is the month of the intensification of prayer. Now, the reality is, as we know, not all Muslims are as observant of their 5 daily prayers as they ought to be. So this is the month to pull your socks up and to make a real resolution to get back to the full practice of your life of prayer, and indeed to make up for prayers that have been missed. So it's a time of spiritual intensification. It's also a time of additional dua and intercession, so that we should be calling upon God and, as it were, expanding our relationship with God during this month. Now, one of the practices that helps us to do this is ihtikaf during the last 10 days of Ramadan, when people will go into a kind of seclusion within the mosque itself. And they will sleep there, they will stay within their little tent, as it were, within the mosque, and only come out during the congregational prayer when they can live most intensely in the presence of God during these days. So a month of great spiritual intensity. Thirdly, it's a month in which we conduct a review of our lives. How do I earn my living? Does the job that I do contribute to the well-being of society, or is it detrimental? Does it exploit people? How do I discharge my duties within the family? Do I spend enough time with the children? Do I take my fair share of responsibility of the housework with my wife? Do I take sufficient care for my own parents, for my wife's parents? Am I playing my part in the wider family affairs? How am I saving my money? Am I making sure that it's not doing something in my name that would be forbidden for me to do? So if I invest my money in a certain company and that company do things that are haram, like I put my money into brewery shares, for example, and they make a profit by alcohol, this is haram for me to do. So I revise my economic life as well. I'm also revising my life within the wider community and society. Do I play my proper part within the life of the Islamic community in which I live? Could I volunteer to do some other work, to be engaged in some other way? Do I have talents that they need? What about in wider society? Do I get involved in the political life of the society in which I live? Either by campaigning or joining groups or joining societies, or by standing for election, and at least being involved in promoting the good and forbidding the evil in society. So it's a reflection on one's own life in every aspect. It's like an annual MOT that we give the car, and this is a spiritual and a physical MOT that we give to ourselves. Ramadan is also the month of charity. Because what kind of a human being would you be if you sat down to a feast on Eid al-Fitr at the end of Ramadan, knowing that your neighbours did not have enough money to buy food for themselves? What kind of a parent would you be if you gave presents to your children for Eid, knowing that your sister could not afford to buy presents for her children for Eid? So this is a time of charity. It is a time when people are to take care of their neighbours, and neighbours here would include people who are suffering in a wider sphere as well. So it may be that actually the people who live immediately around me are all relatively comfortable. There's no shortage of people in need in the world. And so there is a compulsory payment which is given for the circulation of wealth to those in need during this month of Ramadan. And one cannot celebrate the Eid at the end until that has been paid. So that in all these ways, Ramadan has many different facets. And it is a time of year that many Muslims will say that they look forward to it greatly. And as it goes on, I wish it could stay longer. Because I wish that the spirit that we have of service to God, of service to humanity, of taking care of each other, of being dependent upon God for our very existence, that these awarenesses could continue. So it's a month that is to carry you through spiritually and physically the rest of the year.
Sometimes that is a situation. However, many occasions when one's fasting, their temper becomes quite high and they tend to have a lot more shortcomings than they usually do. In that sense, how can we remind ourselves to control ourselves in these situations? Yes, food and water are very important to a person, but as you said, the most important thing is the spiritual aspect and one's behaviour. So in that, how can we help ourselves in managing our temper?
Well, these are the real temptations. This is the great jihad. We are fighting against our lower inclinations, our weaknesses. And Ramadan is a month of serious hand-to-hand combat, as it were, with our lower inclinations. This is the time that we should be fighting them. Now, that's not to say it's going to be easy, and it's not to say we're going to succeed, but we ought to be making serious progress. And so if we find that we get angry and short-tempered because we're hungry and so on, well, that's the time to go off for a walk and take yourself away from other people so that you don't express your anger to them. That's the time that you make additional dua. That's the time that you say, well, instead of sitting here being angry, I'll go off and read another portion of Quran. Because these are the tools that fight against the lower nafs. And we have to implement them during this month. And even if you don't become perfect this Ramadan, maybe the next Ramadan.
That's true, and hopefully every year someone's able to actually perfect something within them. But then when looking at the Islamic calendar, Ramadan is nearly towards the end of the year, and usually because Ramadan, as you said, is a time where someone would keep reflecting on themselves, and it's as if it's an annual MOT where they're kind of like putting new aims for themselves. Isn't it usually like within our usual calendar, like in December or January, that's when we put our New Year's resolutions? But in the Islamic calendar, it's towards the end. Do you think there's an actual reason for that?
I just think that it's down to the wisdom of God, really. I think that there is more wisdom in the fact that it moves through the seasons of the year so that it is not fixed in any way, because it is to remind us of shaking up these fixities in our lives and thinking that we've got it all under control. It is a time when many people will calculate their zakat or their khums payment, for example, because it's a time for total honesty before God, when I shouldn't be hiding my accounts away and saying, well, those £3,000 don't really count. So it is that sort of end of term analysis, as it were. And of course, it comes before the season of Hajj. And the season of Hajj is marked by seeking forgiveness from those that we have wronged in any way. And so Ramadan is a very good time for just taking stock of my relationships and saying, is there something, have I offended you in some way? Is there something that we ought to repair before we come to Hajj, or in this case, before we come to the end of Ramadan? So in that way, there is a sense in it being within that season.
With Ramadan being celebrated a lot in the West, how can we help people that don't really know much about the Islamic religion and about Ramadan? How can we tell them about the holy month and why we're actually fasting?
I think that I would have two answers for that. The first is that when we tell them about it, we must make sure not just to focus on the negative, we don't eat and drink. Because that looks crazy to people. Why do you not do that? That's daft. We need, as it were, to help people to see the whole package, the package of spiritual as well as physical renewal. The second thing is that there is a long and proud tradition of inviting friends and neighbours and acquaintances to come and break the fast together. And so to make iftar in groups together and to reach out to people in this way. Now this may be reaching out to the poor and homeless people, and there are some groups who will celebrate iftar throughout Ramadan by taking food to the homeless people. It may be through our neighbours. We invite people from the neighbourhood in, come and learn something about what's going on. It may be with the people with whom we work. So it's a really good opportunity to explain in that way and to share some hospitality with them. But I think our explanation has to be, as it were, from A to Z and not just from A to C.
We have to always look at the bigger picture of it.
We have to help people to see how the fasting of Ramadan plays into our whole spiritual growth and also enables us in our daily lives to become more full of taqwa, more God-centered, and therefore more obedient to the guidance of God.
But sometimes during Ramadan, there are some, because we haven't been eating for a long time, when one breaks their fast, there are so many different choices to choose from. And this is where sometimes Muslim families forget the concept of Ramadan and tend to, go all out for food and stuff their faces to the extent that they can't move anymore. With situations like that, how can we make sure that we're not going against the whole message of Ramadan? Because of course there isn't anything that says, don't eat until you're filled. There isn't such a thing. But at the same time, we sometimes go against the whole core message of Ramadan. So how can we ensure we're following the core message?
I think this is horribly true, really. I mean, some people put on weight during Ramadan because they've been eating so much at all these different iftars. And I put on iftar last week and you were invited. I know you're going to invite this week and you want to make sure it's better than what I put on last week. Yeah. So we get into this sort of cycle. These need to be broken. And one way of breaking that is to radically simplify the kind of food that we have. And to actually say, we are to nourish our bodies, not that I will bake my 20 favourite dishes every night. Because I don't think there's any other way of actually breaking through that without saying we are going to prepare one simple dish which will be adequate for us all to nourish ourselves for the day. There is a tradition of Imam Ali that he didn't ever eat more than one dish in any one meal. So the idea of there being 20 different things that you have to try from, and it will be bad manners if you don't, is not part of the practice of Imam Ali. So I think especially in the Shia tradition, we have to learn that there is a moderation in terms of breaking the fast, just as there is a moderation in all other things during the month of Ramadan.
You know, you mentioned the part of sunset. Some people, and the punctuality of breaking one's fast according to the time. Some people, because in the West the lighting is a bit different and it doesn't become dark straight away, it takes it quite a long time for it to become like really dark. Is it wrong for them not to break their fast straight away because, you know, they're just waiting for the sky to be a bit darker?
Well, this is a question that must be referred to the scholars of fiqh, because this varies from one school to another. There are those schools, particularly in the Sunni tradition, that say that sunset is when the disk of the sun disappears from sight, whatever the condition of the sky. And then the broad Shia position is to say that the reflected light of the sky must have passed over so that night has fallen. Now, as you say, that's quite difficult in a society which has so much electric lights and street lamps and so on. So we must ask the scholars for guidance on that as to how exactly that is to be interpreted in our 24-hour day light society. But those are the basic two principles.
Thank you very much for joining us on the show, Chris, and sharing your knowledge with us about the concept of Ramadan and about fasting. And thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.